Last month we focused on the topic of grace in our I-58 teaching, and I shared three real-life grace stories, and I also shared what 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9 has to say about the topic of grace. And this month we are continuing our focus on grace, but what I'd like to address today is a temptation that we have whenever we approach the topic of grace. You see, for some reason, whenever we are overcome by temptation, sometimes we have the almost a temptation within that temptation to just kind of use grace as a comp out to sin. We can say, hey, Jesus died for me, he rose for me, I've got his grace, so yeah, I know that I'm not supposed to sin, but I'm going to go ahead and do it because I'm really tempted and I'm a moment of weakness, and it doesn't really matter because Jesus will forgive me for it. And I want to illustrate this tendency by sharing a personal story with you. A couple of months ago, I had a husband contact me, and he just shared about his valley that he was experiencing within his marriage relationship with his wife. And as he just shared his story, I could tell he was not happy, he was not content, and he even confessed that there really was no biblical grounds for a divorce. There was no sexual immorality, there was no infidelity, no cheating, nothing like that. However, he went on to explain, Seth, although there is really no biblical grounds for a divorce, I'm going to go ahead and do that anyway. So he went on to explain that he really contacted me to ask me a question. So I encouraged him to ask me the question. And he said, Seth, although this is a sin that I realize, and there's no biblical grounds for this divorce, if I go ahead and get this divorce, will Jesus forgive me for that? And that's a powerful question. So I answered his question in this manner. I explained, hey, listen, Christ's grace is powerful. We get forgiveness of sins, but you have to understand that whenever we stumble into sin, we change. We change mentally. Our mindset changes. Sin can change our hearts, our emotions, our affections. Sin can also change our behaviors, our habits, especially if it's a sin that could be highly addictive. It's very dangerous to do that, but also it affects us, our relationship with Christ. And when we stumble into sin, we just really turn our backs on him and we begin to bow down to whatever sin we're committing against him. And on the other side, when we walk out of that sin, we're changed. So I went on and explained to this husband, I said, friend, you talk about how you thirst for grace, Christ's forgiveness this side before you walk through that unbiblical divorce. But who's to say that you're even going to want Christ's grace on the other side after that sinful process has changed you in multiple ways? And that was really the man's gamble that he faced. And before we grab up our stones of judgment and just kind of throw them at this guy in judgment, we need to examine our own hearts. Because if we were all honest, we would confess that we can develop that mentality at times. Every Christian struggles in sin at times. We do. James chapter 3 verse 2 says we all stumble in many ways. So if we were honest, we would think, if you can think back to the last time that you fell into the process of sin, and that sin, just what all it entailed, you would confess that, you know what, before that sin took place, when I was being tempted, part of that temptation was just go ahead and give in to the sin. Jesus will forgive you for it anyway. And this is a deadly, deadly mentality to have because it can affect our relationship with Jesus Christ. I want to address this deadly mentality when approaching grace with some scripture. First of all, I want to use 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9, which we used last month. And that's when Jesus says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. I want to focus on that last part of the verse when Jesus said, my power is made perfect in weakness. How is Christ's power made perfect in weakness? Well, it's made perfect when we open, one of the ways is that when we open up our hearts and our lives to him, even when we walk down the path of temptation, when we allow His power to empower us to overcome that temptation. That's one way that His power is made perfect in weakness. So the question that I need to ask all of us is, how do we do that? How do we help Christ's power allow us to overcome temptation when it comes our way? Because that's really the path that we need to take whenever we're tempted. Not to give in to the sin and kind of use grace as a cop-out to take advantage of it. No, we need to overcome it through Christ's power. So how do we do that? Galatians chapter 5, verse 25 sheds some insight for us and helps answer this question. It says, since we live by the Spirit, let us keep in step with the Spirit. So one of the really practical ways that I've found to obey this verse is that whenever I'm tempted, and whenever that thought comes to my mind, go ahead and give in to the sin, Seth. Go on. Jesus will forgive you for it. It's in those moments that I've found it is extremely helpful for me to pray, for me to just cry out to Christ and acknowledge His presence. Because whenever we stumble into temptation, sometimes it's like this spiritual cloud overshadows our lives, and we have this tendency to lose sight of our relationship with Christ when He's still there. So by praying then, we recognize that He's still with us, and there's power in that. And that in itself, when we realize that Jesus is with us, we open up our hearts to Him. We allow Him to empower us to overcome that specific temptation. So at this time, what I want to encourage you to do is to take a few moments and spend some time with your family. Get with your spouse, get with your kids, and cover the discussion questions that you find along with this email. Walk through those discussion questions so that your family can grow in your faith with Jesus Christ together.